another video in the Beyond Bad and Stupid series. Yeah, I like this. So we'll call this Volume 2. So another defense of Nietzsche and, basically nihilism. Somebody posted on my website that Nietzsche wasn't a nihilist. He was. Yeah, so, fuck you.
Well, this is stating obvious, but good and evil are value judgments. And if you want to find a value judgment, you won't find it out there, out in the universe or whatever. That's precisely...
Yeah, okay, so value isn't a tree. Yeah, it isn't a rock, it isn't a planet, it isn't a meteor. It is an invisible property that exists out there. It's still a property. Now, you can say that there is no such thing as a value. There's no such thing as something being true. A true statement regarding value. You can say it, but I'm saying that I don't think logically you can defend that position, because there are statements I could make. I can compare two circumstances. I can say, two people, one with a knife in their head, one with no knife in their head. Everything else is exactly the same, except one is screaming in horrible pain for 500 years and one isn't for 500 years. And you could say there's no rational statement, no rational defense if you had the choice to choose one of those two realities as existing, not to say that it would be preferable to choose the one that is not in horrible pain. We know the value of sentience. We experience sentience. The fact that it produces value can't be rationally argued against. There's no conceivable rational argument that you can present that would make it possible for me not to understand that it's better, that I have preferable states, that there are states that I exist in that are less good than other states, or less bad, however you want to use the verbiage. But that there is this good and bad quality existing. It's a quality produced by sentient organisms. They create value. How can you say they don't? But to require me to give you a material, to pull a value out of the ground and show you its roots, I can't do that. I can only show you its logical roots. And I can only testify as a consciousness that I'm quite certain that my consciousness is in states that are decidedly less preferable and more preferable. Decidedly, unquestionably, undeniably, undoubtedly, absolutely, in and of themselves. Quite obviously, we can endure pain for some future gain, and likewise, there is no likewise. Yeah, leave it at that.
I guess the sort of thing that the somewhat, perhaps pronouncedly individualistic philosophy was promoting, was the idea that value is not to be found out there.
Right, so he's still, again, this argument that there's no value truth, that we can't establish some premises that establish the fact that sentient creatures are fundamentally different from non-sentient matter, that sentient creatures are in conditions that are good and bad, and that those conditions create value. Now, what is exactly unreasonable about that premise as a description of reality?
Which is why I'm always confused by the question, or by the supposition that the universe has no value. So please, if you want to say that there is value, then it's your case to prove. Well, value doesn't work like that. It's not...
Well, see, now it says you. You're saying value doesn't work like that. But it does work like that. There's a truth to be discovered. Like all philosophy, philosophy is an effort to discover the truth. Not to make stuff up, not to be a psychologist, not to feed you candy, not to feed you what you want to hear. It's to describe what the reality is. And the reality is that when the whole game is played out, there'll either be more of this bad or more of the good, or the less bad. You know, I'd say it's always going to run in the red, but it can be more red. It can be bloodier or less bloody. And the blood could be a metaphor for value. And it's not a very distant metaphor, as one could clearly associate the spilling of blood with the wasting or squandering of suffering.
Something that is independently verifiable.
Again, through logic. It's independently verifiable if you can agree on a premises. Then it's independently verifiable. You can do the logic yourself and see that there's no counter-argument. There's no rational counter-explanation. Clearly, my own experience testifies to me, my own sentience tells me, informs me of the existence of sentience, this qualitative state of being. It reeks in my consciousness of its substance. It reeks. The feelings are so weighted in value that I can't deny their value reality. It's impossible for me to imagine how the worst suffering I endure has no meaning, that it wouldn't matter whether I was suffering or not suffering. It's an inconceivable notion.
And I think that we run into all kinds of trouble if we assume that it is. The answer
again says you. Yes, all kinds of trouble you're worried about is the fact that you're going to have to make some determinations about function, and you're going to have to make some judgments, and you're running from that possibility. And I guess the other problem is created in the sense that maybe you want to do things in life as a selfish individual that now you couldn't justify because you understand the value dynamic, and that dynamic dictates that you can't abuse something else for your benefit.
Or the question, show me where the value is, or show me the value of anything, contains in itself, or the demand, or, show me the value of anything, or of the universe, or of the world, or of life, that demand contains in itself its own solution. Value is not showable.
Well, it is. All I have to do is ask you to imagine your own consciousness, or analyze your own consciousness, and value will become apparent. There's no honest. I don't think there's an honest testimony that could say, no, I don't know what you mean about having a preferable state. All states to me are equal. I don't care whether I feel good or I feel bad. It's of no interest to me. Of course it's of interest to you, and it's of interest to you for good reason, because the value is reeking. It's made itself clear to you.
And just because something isn't showable doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, because, again, we're not looking out there for anything. And, of course, that leads us to the Nazi thing. Well, then I can decide.
Yeah, well, I don't think it really does. But, again, I think it's always, it's an invisible property. Let's just concede. Yes, you can't go look for it with a telescope or a microscope or some any other kind of scope. You can only find it through logic. And, again, your own testimony is this instrument that makes it quite obvious to you. How can you deny the existence of your sentience? How can you deny the fact that it is a substantive thing, and you know it to be?
That white people are the master race. Well, yes, you can. But again, haven't we already...
Well, I mean, you can't for logical reasons. So that argument can't be made anyway, because that's a description of a premised value anyway. There's already built into the argument some sort of premise that there is a better race. So you've already established the existence of value, so you've already broken the nihilistic rule that you can make up anything. Well, you're not making up anything, you're making up something very specific, and that can be challenged based on the implications of what it would be built out of. So to make the argument that, okay, I'm saying value is, and I'm saying that this race is better than another race. So now you've declared a value, you've declared its existence, so in a sense, they can be challenged individually. So I can challenge any nihilist who ever claims there to be a distinction. As soon as a nihilist says, I think I want, it would be good for me, well then they can say that. They can say what's good for them. But if they say something that projects further than them, then they're making a statement about other things, and that can be challenged based on their declaration of the existence of a value. So if they say that I want to eat a woman's brain, and now they go out and say I'm just going to find a woman and take her brain. Well, as soon as now they say there's an implication in what they're saying is that the woman has no value. So they're making a statement saying the woman has no value, or less value than the individual taking her brain. So the claim can be made that, well, your want isn't more valuable than her want by any rational description. She doesn't want you to eat her brain, so her claim to have a right to want what she wants is still capable of challenging your claim that you have a right to take. So again, you've created value as soon as you said that I'm entitled. So as soon as you take your value declarations outside of yourself, outside of making judgments about yourself, and you start making judgments about the world, you're no longer a nihilist, because now you're making judgments about the world.
Established that value isn't out there. So just because you believe that white people are the master race, it does not automatically follow that you go out and do something about that.
Well, it would follow that you do something based on what you believe. It's perfectly rational. That's logical. Believing that you're the master race, again, is a perfectly challengeable statement or declaration. So if you're going to base your action on the premise that you have a belief that you say is genuine or substantive or real or factual, then it can be challenged. If you're saying it's not factual, it's not genuine, it's just bullshit you made up, well then you have a right to say, yes, I believe my people are the master race, but I know that that's just a pile of crap I just made up. You can't claim any claim to logic. As soon as you make a claim to logic for your belief, then I can challenge the value. I can challenge your statement as if you declared the value, because it has to be premised on a presumption that there's a logical foundation for your value declaration.
Because the value of what you believe is only to be found here. I don't really think that it truly runs that risk.
Here, I guess he was pointing to his brain. It's all out of sync, so there's no way to hear that. But again, it's not. It's a description of a reality. And it's either an accurate or inaccurate description. There's just no way of escaping that. Again, as soon as you take your value declarations outside of yourself, outside of declarations about yourself, they're perfectly challengeable. You want to tell me that your sentience is, like I said, there's no distinction between feeling good and feeling bad. You can't really tell the difference. It really wouldn't matter one way or the other. You're indifferent rationally and emotionally because there is so little difference. There's no value difference. fine. But again, as soon as you take that statement and apply it to these other entities, I'm going to claim their consciousness is more genuine than your consciousness. That their consciousness is obviously more real, that it might be more like my consciousness. Because in my consciousness, there's a clear distinction between feeling well and feeling unwell.
If you see that kind of philosophy or that kind of position for what it is, you can't forget the fact that we went looking for value internally because it was not to be found externally, and then impose that value on the external.
Well, again, that's in your statement is all these premises that this is the truth, that the fact is that there's no value creation in the existence of the sentient organism. I'm going to say that's just wrong. That's an inaccurate description of reality. Consciousness is different than non-consciousness. What happens to a rock and what happens to a cute little kitty are different. There's a difference in their arrangement of matter, and that difference is substantial in the value property. The value property is the difference.
Because there is no external value. It's also a pretty good argument, if you ask me, for the very common belief that before you start philosophizing, you have to have a strong foundation of self-discipline.
Yeah, whatever. Just this arrogance and pompousness that you somehow possess discipline because what? Because you run from any conclusion ever? I mean, that's not discipline. That's retarded. You have totally inhibited logic by saying there is no such thing, essentially. That you will establish nothing as real, nothing as vulnerable to logical challenge, because you will always just make it go away. You'll just keep claiming it went away, it disappeared. As soon as I want it to disappear, it disappears. There's no point in calling that a discipline. That's dysfunction, not discipline.
I'm not saying that I'm the most self-disciplined person on earth, but there's very few philosophies that I follow that actually have any strong application in the real world.
Well, yeah, I don't even understand how a philosophy, a description of reality, can't have application in the real world. So I don't understand what good a philosophy is if it has something to do with describing aspects of reality that aren't relevant to your existence. I mean, it would seem like that's like saying I am figuring out the atomic weight of meteorites or something. You know, some sort of irrelevant philosophy. I don't understand how anything that's called what all philosophy is essentially focused on the fact that it has to somehow be relevant to the conduct of human affairs, or else it's philosophy of no use or value. It's like indexing cartoons or something, or reading comic books. The philosophy of comic bookology or something. What use would this be?
That to me, that's not what philosophy is.
Yeah, well, to me, I don't think you have any clue what philosophy is. Philosophy is an attempt to describe a reality, the parts that are not accessible through scientific instrumentation, the parts that have to be accessible through logical interpretation. And you're just saying, I will not do logical interpretation because I will not establish the existence of a reality. Well, I think that's just fucktarded.
Knowledge is knowledge.
How could it possibly be knowledge when it's anti-knowledge? I mean, it's not knowledge. You've created a bunch of anti-knowledge. You've created this. You've said it's the truth that nothing is anything. Nothing is anything. You won't describe anything, and you won't judge anything, and you won't value anything, and you won't establish any truth about the existence of anything in this universe. And then you talk as if you're a philosopher. How could you possibly be a philosopher? You're not describing anything. You're saying, I'm so uncertain of anything's anythingness that I will not establish a single premise that's relevant.
So, yes, Nietzsche's idea of value, of beyond good and evil, could indeed lead to all kinds of crazy ideas. But the very fact that his view of the nature of value is that it's only to be found internally.
Well, whatever. Again, that's he's wrong. I'm just saying it's just wrong thinking. It's logically deducible. And the evidence generated by your own sentience provides the evidence of it. If we were not sentient and we had to deal with this problem of, let's say, the animals were sentient and we were not, we were just a thinking machine, and all we did was process information, it would be difficult for us to understand sentience. We could hear testimony, we could hear screams, we could see behaviors that indicated there was something happening, that there were different states that this thing was existing in, different brain states. But it would be very difficult without the fact that we do have personal experience with it. But if you're not capable of establishing that what happens to a sentient is meaningful, that it is distinctly different than what happens to non-sentients, then yes, everything becomes irrelevant. But it only becomes irrelevant because you've extinguished, through just word games, a distinction that's obvious. You have to explain the difference. You have to account for the difference. You cannot just say, you're a tennis ball. Yes, you're a tennis ball. You have a little more complexity than a tennis ball, but you're just a tennis ball. I'm not just a tennis ball. I'm conscious, and it means something.
Cuts across any idea of his ideas being used for any, evil purposes, if I dare use that word, or perhaps undesirable purposes, like, the Third Reich. Thank you.
Yeah, the Third Reich are, like I said, any kind of projection of a value negation. But again, the counter argument to that, I'm going to argue that that's what you end up doing. You end up giving psychopaths, crazy fucks, you end up empowering them. But they're going to be impervious to these logical arguments. But the fact is, they have committed a logical violation. They can be argued out of their philosophy, only because there is a definition of value in their statements. They are making value judgments. They're claiming there to be no value, and yet they're making value judgments. They can't do that. That's not logically consistent. So that's where you can get to the core of that, because you just go right, and you could just go right to their motivations and their desires, and have them explain why their desire to do this thing has any meaning or any purpose or any function, and they would have to somehow defend what they're doing. They'd have to defend the motivation, and saying, it's my will to power. Well, maybe they can do that. That's another problem with Nietzsche. He's facilitating the psychopath in both ways, by denying the fact that you're just a desire machine and calling it a power consuming machine instead, which disengages you from the argument that, yes, your desire is just a trivial personal ambition and goal, a goal, a value judgment established by your biology, and that if you act on that, you're denying the non-value reality. You're denying the nihilism that's built into the conclusion that nothing is truth in terms of value. I think you get my point. But the point is that it can be argued against, because the fallacy is that you are not making value judgments when you make the value judgment that there is no value. You can't do that and still act in the world. As soon as you act in the world, you're making a value judgment.